Hi, my name is Tanweer Rajwani. I'm from the University of Houston. I'd like to thank the George Washington University for hosting this debate tournament, as well as the French Embassy for providing us with this opportunity. Lastly, I'd like to thank Kristen Lowe from Emory University for providing the first affirmative speech. I negate. I will argue that effective climate change policy is not the responsibility of all states, but rather the few developed and industrial nations that have caused climate change to become such an existential threat to our species and this planet. Professor Kihon and Victor of Princeton and UC San Diego argue that the efforts to find a single mechanism to solve climate change will inevitably fail. They write, "We argue for making the best of this situation rather than continuing the elusive goal of a comprehensive integrated regime, a goal that is both unattainable and distracts policymakers from more effective strategies." Ask yourself, have the global responses to climate change from the past 2 decades been successful? The Kyoto Protocol very much so embodied the resolution, but it failed to produce successful solutions to climate change. While it is easy for us to regurgitate the role of ethical responsibility, I urge you to examine the practicality in your consideration of whether all states ought to combat climate change. If continually forcing every single member of our global community to become a part of the climate justice movement has empirically proven a failure, then why continue the same path? If certain nations are capable of successfully combating climate change, then why not put the burden on those developed industrial nations to mitigate the problems that they have created? Countries such as America, China, and various nations from the European Union have been disproportionate contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. As such, I argue that these nations have a greater obligation to combat climate change. The affirmative stipulates that developing nations account for over half of greenhouse gas emissions and that their emissions are expected to skyrocket. This is, however, an unfortunate characterization that is not compelling when understood in context. The final installment of the IPCC's 5th assessment on climate change declared that a 40% reduction in carbon dioxide would be necessary to keep warming under 2 degrees Celsius threshold. While upon first examination this is a daunting number, the unfairness of depending on developing nation to shoulder the burden becomes more clear when one considers that the emissions of China, the United States, and India combine for almost 44% of global emissions. When the emissions of 3 nations almost equal the emissions of the 190 other nations, then the very concept of common but differentiated responsibility becomes suspect. Now my opponent calls for us to have an ethical response. Professor Mayer from the National University of Singapore writes that the very concept of common but differentiated response is ambiguous, for some may very argue that the responsibility refers to unspecific prospective duty of assistance instead of the causal retrospective responsibility of the injurer. Ask yourself, what does common but differentiated response mean? How does it translate to specific actions that can be taken by specific nation states? In order for our approach to climate change to be effective, we need a very concrete proposal to combat climate change. Again, remind yourself of the failed conferences for climate change from the past 2 decades, such as the Kyoto Protocol. They all called for common but differentiated responses. And where has that gotten us? Well, the affirmative indicates that it's certainly not on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to fit the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. Finally, the affirmative calls for climate change to be a global threat that deserves a global response. We agree that it is a global threat, but we urge you to understand that it isn't a global creation. It is a purely industrial creation. As such, our response to it cannot solely be global. It has to outline specific responsibilities for the causers of the climate change. As such, it is the obligation of the industrial states to facilitate our response to climate change rather than affirming a vague ethical model of all states doing whatever they can and whatever they want to reduce greenhouse emissions. Thank you very much for taking your time to listening to my speech, and I hope to see you in DC this spring.